for sure.
Perfect. So, hi everyone. We're here today to discuss mastering self-leadership, nurturing adaptability, and personal growth with Alain, a thought leader in leadership. So, Alain, thanks so much for joining us. And
It's my pleasure.
if you can do a short intro about yourself, your expertise, and why we're here today.
Sure, happy to, and it's great to be with you here, Ioanna. And so, thanks for watching, folks. So my name is Alain Hunkins. Alain, it's a French name. My mom is from Brussels, Belgium. I'm from Flushing, Queens. And I'm an American, but I have worked all around the world. So, and what I've been doing for the last 27 years now is I basically work with individuals, teams, and organizations to help them achieve their organizational results better by strengthening their leadership capacity, which sounds like it should be something easy to do. But as we all know, leadership is a lot easier to talk about than to actually implement. And so, so today we're going to be looking at mastering self-leadership through nurturing accountability and personal growth, because the fact is you can't separate out leadership development from personal development, because it's all about the person and really in some ways looking at it from the inside out. So I've had the good fortune to work with companies literally all around the world. I think I've worked in 28 countries now. And so I'm just excited for our conversation and hope that we can help you all, that is the audience today, walk away with some simple, pragmatic, practical tools that you can take and start to apply and start to, it's really two things we want to focus on today. One is, what's your mindset, right? Because unless you shift a mindset, humans are by nature creatures of habit. So we tend to kind of do what we do just because that's what we're comfortable with. So we want to shift our mindset, but then also look at what are some specific tools that we can take away to use and apply. Because if we want to change mindset and change habits, we have to do things differently. And we only do things differently if we have new tools to apply to what we do. So so that's kind of what it's about. And and you can see over my shoulder, I'm the author of this book, Cracking the Leadership Code. And so I do individual executive coaching, group coaching, as well as facilitation workshops and keynote speaking and writing. I'm currently a leadership strategy columnist for Forbes.
Wow. Yeah, you definitely know how to keep yourself busy.
Yeah, no lack of stuff to do, for sure.
But I love what you said, because for me as a talent developer, I always said, if you don't have someone who has their life figured out, it's very hard to tell them how to get out of their comfort zone career-wise and help them, achieve their goals. So very interesting. So let's get started with some questions and see how this conversation goes.
Okay.
In general, it's also the topic of our conversation. Leading oneself requires a certain level of self-accountability, right? So how can individuals, in your experience, hold themselves accountable for their actions, their commitments, their personal growth, when there's an absence of external accountability structures, especially at work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So before we jump into that question, I want to unpack the question a little bit, and I just ask everyone to think, when you hear the words self-accountability, or when you're going to hold yourself accountable, what's your initial emotional response to that, right? So what I have found in working with lots and lots of people is oftentimes when people hear things like accountability or holding yourself accountable, it brings up fear, anxiety, shame, like, oh, I didn't do this, and that time out. So let's just back up. Let's take a look at the definition of accountability, because, we oftentimes say, I have to hold myself accountable. I have to hold them accountable. What does that really mean? So I love where the etymology, the origin of the word accountability comes from. And you can find it. It's in the word. It's from accounting. How did we get into accounting? So for those that are probably if you ever took an accounting class, even one, you probably learned what a balance sheet is, right? So on the one side, you have your assets. The other side, you have your liabilities, or you could call it your credits and your debits. Doesn't matter. And the idea is, in a balance sheet, for it to balance, the one side has to equal the other side, right? The assets have to equal the liabilities, expense, right? All that stuff. Okay, so let's take that out of the world of accounting and let's put that into the world of self-accountability around leadership. What do the two sides mean? First side is what I say I'm going to do, what I promise to myself I'm going to do. Other side is, did I do it? So think about that for a second. So when you are self-accountable, it means you do what you say you are going to do. Now, I think a lot of people find it's actually in some ways easier if they are accountable to somebody else than to themselves. Because if the only person that you tell about your commitments is you, if you don't follow through, where's the consequence? Well, you know where the consequence is, which is you're sort of feeling, oh, I'm stuck, I can't move forward. So the first thing I would suggest, there's kind of a few parts to this around self-accountability. First of all, I think there are a lot of people who have great hopes, desires, intentions to do something. I want to grow my business. I want to start a business. I want to quit my job and start a business. Whatever it is, you have these hopes. However, how have you gone from hope to specific intention, right? So in terms of, okay, I am going to do this. Like this week, I am going to read this book that someone said I should read. Or this week, I'm going to send out 3 resumes, or I'm going to start prospecting for clients. But to actually very explicitly name your commitments, right? And I would even go as far as write them down, have them somewhere where they're out of your brain on paper, where you can see them. And ideally, they're written so clearly that if anyone else was to read them and they came back and said, hey, this thing that you wrote down here, did you do it? The answer is as simple as yes or no, as opposed to, well, I meant to, but we're very good as humans to, shift and be slippery and wriggle out of our commitments because we don't like to look at ourselves as failures, right? So this is the thing. So what I would suggest is start there. The next step around self-accountability is don't think of growth, and this is a challenge, I think, particularly in Western society, is we tend to think of all of this personal development, leadership development. We tend to think of this as an individual solitary, like it's up to me, it's an action that we have to do. When in fact, it's great if you can do this in community. So get an accountability buddy. I know coaches who pay people to call them at night just to read them a list of questions they wrote to themselves. Okay. I mean, isn't that right? They do this because they know there's something about the fact that a real live other human being is going to get on the phone and say, did you try your best at this? Did you exercise today? Did you tell your significant other that you love them? Did you do something of service? I mean, that's their list of values. Now, that doesn't have to be your list of values, but whatever your list of values and commitments are, find it, make a list, do something to start doing this. And here's the other piece around accountability. And I know I'm going on this, but it's a really important topic. Is so if you don't follow through on what you did, I say I'm going to reach out and call 3 people, and I don't do it for whatever reason. Don't go down the shame rabbit hole. Don't go into the, oh, I didn't, oh, I'm just, right? On the one hand, you could say you failed. It's true. You did not follow through on your commitment. You are not accountable to what you said you're going to do. This is a perfect learning opportunity, right? Because some people love to say, it's not about, there is no failure, it's only learning. So what got in your way? Because this is real life. So what got in your way? What did you choose to do instead? What was the mindset? Was it too much fear? Did you get distracted by other things? Is it your organizing system? Because whatever it is, there's something going on that kept you from following through. So figure out what it is and learn from it so you can do things differently moving forward, right? So if we think, and I know we'll talk more about growth mindset in a little while, but that's this idea of a growth mindset, right? If there's no failure, there's only results. There's only learning. So these are learning moments. What can we do with these learning moments to move forward? So that probably, I would say, Ioanna, is the place to start when it comes to self-accountability.
And do you think it can also show you that maybe whatever that thing was is not that important for you? Like subconsciously, you didn't do it because you actually don't care so much to go to the gym, let's say, or to do something like that.
Absolutely. I think it can totally show you, is it not that important? It's also a question of, we've all probably heard some variation of this, are you doing things because you want to, or because someone told you and you feel like you should do this? So even before we get into self-accountability, what I would suggest is you go through some kind of values exercise where you get really clear around what your own values are, and then what are you committing to? Because I'm always amazed. I mean, I coach executives who are, let's say, in their mid-30s, their 40s, and frankly, they have gone down a road because someone early on said, oh, you should do this, you should do that, you're smart, you should go to, like, they'll tell me a story of, yeah, I had this teacher in the 8th grade who said, you're really smart, you should be a lawyer. And so for what, or their parents, like, you should go to law school. And so they go to law school, and then they're in their 30s, their 40s, they're going, you know what? I'm living out somebody else's values. This is not my, this is like, the Talking Head song. This is not my beautiful house. This is not, right? How did I get here? Right. And so this whole sense of getting really clear, and, all of what we're talking about around self-leadership, the word that comes to mind to me, it's courage. Like, how much courage do you have to live your own life, right? And to play by your own rules. I mean, there are so many markers, whether it's social media, LinkedIn, work, society, that are telling you you should fit into this box, right? And so you can spend your whole life trying to fit into a box, and you'll get to a point, maybe it's on your deathbed, you're like, crap.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. Hopefully a lot sooner. But the fact is, and I think it's really important to revisit these things on a regular basis too. What are you doing to revisit what are the values that you have and what's going on? So yeah, so that's a really, really great question there, Ioanna.
An awesome reminder for everyone to just be themselves and live their truth, So sometimes there are external factors that avoid us from growing and reaching these goals and keeping ourselves accountable. So I would love to know your definition of toxic environments, toxic behaviors that might prevent us from our own personal growth. And is there any misconceptions about it that you've heard, you've seen people believe from your clients, the people you work with?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like, we have all experienced toxic behaviors. We all have at various points. Hopefully, we experience them not very often, and not very often, and not very intensely, and they don't have a huge impact. And it's interesting because I also have worked with people who seem to attract toxic behaviors. It's like, it seems like every time there's some kind of a drama or something going on. So let's just kind of start with kind of what are toxic behaviors, because that is in some ways a big blanket generalization that covers a bunch of different stuff. And for those that are really curious, there's been some really great research that came out of that was published by the MIT Sloan Management Review in February and March of this year. And what they found, and they found this by actually reviewing something like 30,000 Glassdoor reviews, right? So different people working at companies, reviewing their own companies and looking for certain keywords. And so out of that, they did a big, giant meta-analysis of all these different reviews. And what they found, that there were 5 specific behaviors that each of them is one aspect or factor of toxicity, toxic behaviors. And I'm going to read them and share them to you in the order of impact they have on people. So the first toxic behavior is disrespect, right? So we all have our own baseline of what respect means. As a human being, is someone respecting you? And there's a lot of different ways to disrespect someone. So for example, a very obvious one is if you make an agreement to do something and you don't follow through. A classic example of that one is particularly around wasting people's time, right? Showing up late or not showing up at all. Or maybe you have a one-on-one with your boss and they're constantly rescheduling because something more important, frankly, than you keeps showing up. So disrespect. And there's something about when we feel slighted and disrespect, it is the strongest form of something's wrong here. And there's a part of you that just wants to eject yourself from the system, remove yourself, detach, because at your core, you realize that is not okay. That is not okay. Another example of disrespect is when people use power over you to get you to do something. And that power could be because I'm your boss. That's why, hey, I know you probably have plans this weekend, but we've got this really big project that's due and I need you to kind of work this weekend to get through this, right? And depending on the track record, and they're like, okay, maybe they don't have any deposits left in the emotional bank account. You're gonna get stuck. So that's the first, right? That's the first of the 5 behaviors, is disrespect. The second one is around being non-inclusive, right? So basically, what are you doing to include, or what are you doing to exclude? And obviously, we could talk a lot about this sense of, how much of this is around unconscious bias, how much of this are microaggressions, things that you do either willingly, intentionally, unconsciously, unintentionally, that basically make someone feel like they're an other, that they don't belong, that and I'll give you an easy example of this. I'm sure many of us now have dealt with calling in for remote meetings, maybe on a Zoom potentially, something like that. So the question becomes, if there's a whole bunch of people who are co-located all together, like in one conference room, and then you're dialing in, do people even, when they're taking comments, do they tend to go to the people in the room first? Or did the people that are calling in, you find that the people who are co-located, there may be one speakerphone in the middle of the conference room, but people aren't even close to it and speaking to, and you find yourself getting frustrated because you go, could you speak into the speakerphone? Could you, I've been in that situation where literally I just hung up and because at some point you're feeling excluded, right? And so it's little, you could say that's a little thing, but it's not a little thing. It's the awareness, right? It's as a leader having the awareness of, how am I going to bring people in? All sorts of things like that. So we've talked about disrespect. We've talked about non-inclusive. Third one is around unethical, right? So when people are asking you to do things that just violates your own sense of core beliefs and ethics, oh, can you do this? Can you fudge this? Like, no. And that's really uncomfortable for people to be able to do that. So that's the third one. That's very self-explanatory. The fourth one is around an environment that's cutthroat, right? Where people are super competitive with each other and people are looking to get ahead at the expense of other people that are supposedly on their team. So an example of this might look like you do some work and someone else taking the credit. Could be your boss, could be someone else taking the credit for your work. Or maybe you speak up in a meeting and then, this is a classic thing that goes on that many people are familiar with. You speak up and no one seems to acknowledge your good input, your good idea. And yet 5 minutes later, somebody else says almost exactly the same thing. Oh my gosh, that's a great idea, Alain. I'm like, yeah, that is. And we didn't hear you. Right. And so you've been squashed in terms of that. And there's a kind of cutthroat environment. And then the fifth and the final one is just downright abusive, right? And so abuse could look like a lot of things. It could look like emotional abuse. It could look like sexual abuse. It could look like physical abuse. When people are in abusive situations, they shrink away from that. And so those are the 5 behaviors that create the bulk of toxicity. And going to your second part of that is misconceptions around this. I think that if you've been in an environment that has toxic behaviors, I think a big misconception is we normalize it. We're like, oh, I guess that's just how things work around here. And I have met so many people who work in corporate organizations who are just like, oh, you mean there's a different way? I mean, as I describe all those things, for example, your boss, wielding power over you, people go, is there a place where they don't do that? Yes, there are. And until you experience something like that, you don't realize like, oh my gosh, I've been living in toxic workplaces my entire life. I had no idea. And so I think one thing to really consider is, you could even break down, okay, take a look, what kind of levels of respect, is this inclusive? Is this ethical? Is this competitive or collaborative? Is it abusive or not? Is to start noticing these things. And what is your tolerance for stuff? Now, recognizing we're not asking people to be perfect, right? However, I can have a bad day, but the thing is, this is true in life as a person or as a leader, do I have the self-awareness that if I'm having a bad day and I'm a little short or something with somebody and I'm, maybe grumpy, do I then come back and go, hey, I need to apologize because I was really having a bad day yesterday. There's a bunch of stuff going on and I feel like I may have given you the impression that I didn't care and I blew you off. I'm sorry. Are we okay? You see how I can repair. So again, it's not about being perfect all the time, but you do need to have the self-awareness because if you continue on in these kind of environments and you don't repair the relationships, they're going to get worse and worse. And then people are going to start looking for and heading for the exits.
Wow, I was taking notes here. I love that study. What's interesting is that I can see the connection between these five like so clearly. Like when you start seeing 2 or 3 signs, it's probably that all of these are coexisting, unfortunately. So I think going back to self-awareness, it's very key to know when you start seeing 1 or 2 red flags that it's only going to get worse unless you address it.
Yeah,
So
very much so. And
yeah.
what you'll see, and I'm sure you've experienced this, a lot of people, they're like, it is what it is, right? Which is kind of our way of avoiding conflict, because let's face it, dealing with any of these things means having a difficult conversation, which most of us aren't very comfortable with much of the time. And a good way, by the way, if you want to start to address some of this stuff and you're feeling uncomfortable about having the courage, is instead of going in, a strategy to not do is to come like, hey, you did this and that was wrong. And like, because that's just going to make you defensive. Hey, as opposed to, hey, can I check in with you something at that meeting? What I saw was this, what I experienced was this. Is that what you meant? So it's just like giving people, assuming positive intent, giving them the benefit of the doubt, but at the same time, being really clear around, here was the data. This is what I saw. This is what you did. Here was the impact that had. Because one of the things, and we can talk about this in terms of growth mindset and self-accountability, is we need to learn how to close the gap between what we intend and how we're being perceived. And at the end of the day, no one cares about what your intentions were. I mean, we all, 99% of people wake up every day. No one's thinking, I want to make someone's life miserable, right? And yet, how many of us feel like there is someone at work and their whole reason for being on this planet is to make my life miserable, right? So it isn't about that. It's really understanding what are we doing in terms of the impact on other people. And so, yeah, so I think starting with that sense, but like you said, it takes courage. It takes courage to be able to do this. But yeah, once 1 or 2 or 3 of those signposts are starting to show up, there's some, warning signs. This may not be a great place to be. And by the way, for those that are wondering what the impact of this, so the number one reason people leave a job is a toxic workplace, by the way, more than anything else. In fact, part of that study I mentioned that was an MIT Sloan Management Review, they said that toxic workplace, in terms of reasons to leave, was 10.2 greater times that they would leave based on a toxic workplace than inadequate compensation, right?
Wow.
So that's pretty impressive. Like, wow, I mean, yeah, think about it, because it just know what the feeling or the vibe is when you show up to a place like that. It makes you want to get out of there.
Yes, and Gen Z today too is a generation that is not tolerating these things. So I'm not surprised they are ready to go if they feel like that. I think change management, is always hard, but when you've been with an organization for 10 years, it's obviously much more unlikely that you will leave, and you probably have tolerated so much. You're like, oh, what's a little more? But,
No, you bring up a really good point. I mean, around the generations,
right.
because what we've seen with, going from X to Y to Z is that each generation has got slightly less tolerant of just the willingness to go and put up with toxic behaviors and things like that. And that could be a lot of things. I mean, I'll just give you an example. This is earlier in my career. I was working with a bunch of millennials coming into the workforce. I was working with one of the big 4 accounting consulting firms, right? And for generations, the model was you'd bring in these people, they just graduated college, and you'd bring them in as entry-level consultants, and you'd pay them decently, but they would work them. They'd work like 60, 70, 75 hours a week. They'd be gone. They'd leave on Sunday. They'd come home on Thursday. And you paid your dues, and that's what you did. And if you wanted to get ahead, you had to kind of put in the hours, and it's a grind. And every week was like that. And that's just how it went for decades. And then the millennials came in, and they looked at the partners in the firm, and they looked at how workaholic they were. And they're like, you know what? All you get out of this is a corner office and some more money. I don't want I won't do this. And what ended up happening is, because en masse, right? All this whole contingent of millennials said, I'm not going to play by those rules. They had to change the rules because supply and demand, they didn't have any entry-level consultants to go do anything. So they started creating more flexibility, or realizing that, we can't work them 60 hours a week. We have to put some limits. And so I applaud the Gen Y, the Gen Z, who are in some ways are changing this based on supply and demand, right? Because, which is fantastic, and it's making a lot of leaders my age and older in the workplace go like, wow, I guess we can't, we're not leading ourselves. No, you're not. You're leading new generations who have a very different value proposition for what work is about. And certainly the pandemic and all that came out of that has just accelerated all of these changes even more so.
Yeah, you see the same for other trends like DI, sustainability. All this is starting from someone saying, no, I don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah.
So awesome. Let's talk a little bit about ego now, which is a topic that is super interesting to me. And it's often cited as a significant factor contributing to toxic behaviors. So how can leaders or even managers, lower levels, effectively manage their own egos to create a culture that discourages this behavior amongst their team members and allows everyone to thrive?
What a good question, Ioanna. So let's talk about this so ego, what is that, right? It's that sense of, ego puts me at the center of things. And I think oftentimes, we talked about earlier about power, do this because I said so. One of the other aspects of power that a lot of people and organizations don't recognize is that power is blind to itself, right? So your executives, your managers, doesn't matter what level, it's different levels, it all's going on. No one's coming in and going, wow, I have all this power over people. They just think it's just me. I'm Alain. I just, they don't stop and recognize their own blindness to what's going on. And what that means is they don't recognize how the system is over functioning for their under functioning. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. So when I come in and I'm saying, do this, do this, do this, I don't recognize and go, oh, people are doing this because their job, their promotion, their potential bonus or, raises is all contingent on me saying, I like you. I think you're okay. Right. And so that's a whole piece of ego that's going on. And so unchecked, we can see egos run amok, right? There's the books of leadership literature are littered with examples of people who had egos that just, and that you can see them contemporarily, and you can look in politics, you can look in corporate, you can look in a lot of places where, and I'll give you an example. I was working with a company, I won't mention which one, but it was in the automotive industry, and I was supposed to do a networking meeting, and I tell you, there was so much fear amongst, so I was brought in from the outside to do this networking session at one of their annual meetings for some of their top 300 leaders. Mm-hmm. Now I was supposed to facilitate this, but everyone inside was so scared about what would the CEO think? What would the CEO think? And so there was meeting after meeting. The number of meetings was just mind-boggling. I had to go through all these and walk this person through and get them on board. And so finally, they made the pitch, which I was not allowed to go to, the pitch to the CEO. And by the way, the fact that the CEO had to approve this shows you what a level of micromanagement was going on. So all of which to say is they finally pitched the CEO, here's what we're going to do. They walk him through, this is what this is about. And apparently, and I have one right here, this is what he did. He was sitting at his desk and he had a Post-it pad like this. And he was just sitting there, and this is what he did. And he showed them. He didn't say anything. He just made a little smiley face. That was it. And I was like, oh my God. So that's just that was it. And that was the meeting. It's basically, it makes you feel like you've got an emperor sitting there who gets to sit on his cushions and just make little Post-it smiley faces and do my bidding, go do all these things. So ego is real. So what are you going to do? So the word that comes to mind to counteract ego is humility, right? Is to realize it's not about you. In fact, my favorite definition of leadership focuses on the fact that leadership isn't about you. It's about being of service to help people to work willingly towards achieving a shared purpose. Notice I use the word willingly, right? So this is about commitment. It's not about because I said so. That's compliance. I mandate this. And so humility is recognizing your job is to help other people succeed, because if they succeed, you succeed, because your results are measured on their results. So when it comes to ego, start being humble And you think, okay, now humble, that's a mindset, but what are the behaviors that you can take? So again, we talked about a mindset, humility. Here are some behaviors or tools you can do. Number one thing that I think you can do to start becoming more humble and put your ego in check is to ask people for feedback. How am I doing? What could I be doing differently? What's working well? And what could I do even better next time that would help you in your job or whatever it is to do better, right? Because just the act of asking for feedback, of course, you have to be genuine about this. If you just go through this as an exercise to say, oh, I heard this webinar and this guy said I should ask people for feedback because that's going to make them think that I have ego. Don't fake this, because let's face it, everyone has got a really good BS detector. So if you're not genuine about actually doing this, people are going to sniff it out and you're going to be worse off than you were before. But assuming that it's genuine, assuming that you want to share with people and grow, yeah, ask for feedback and then act on it. It is the number one thing that is going to help you accelerate your own leadership learning curve around learning how to put your ego in check and become more of a servant-oriented leader. So there you go. Feedback, humility, and just make sure that you're in check with all of that big ego stuff.
Yeah, and this opens another window of, how do we receive feedback and how we give feedback. And it's really hard sometimes, because you mentioned earlier, two people become very defensive and words are just so fragile and they can have such a huge difference in how your message is being conceived. But I think I've heard a lot about, ways to give feedback and the sandwich method and other methods. But in your experience, what is the most effective way to give feedback? And is this something that again changes based on this generation, or is there kind of a one way you've seen work for everyone?
Yeah. So I'm going to share a way that I think works for everyone. And the first thing is, I think you need to get rid of the idea of feedback is an event. Feedback is, oh, every 3 months, we're going to sit down, I'm going to give you some feedback. If you think of it that way, that's very much of a fixed mindset. And it's like feedback being used as a kind of mechanical correction tool. Instead of thinking of feedback as an event, I want you to think of feedback as part of what you do every day, all day. Okay. It's like having that mindset of how do you create a culture that is feedback rich. I mean, the fact is, ideally, I mean, let's use a metaphor here for a second. If you're driving a car, you are getting feedback constantly. You never just hold on to the steering wheel. You're constantly making little adjustments based on the lines and where's the car going. So you're in constant monitoring feedback. That's feedback, right? You're driving, but you're getting feedback and you're never exactly on course. You're constantly correcting. And that's true, in a car, in a plane, all these different things. So the first thing I would say is it's really hard to have a culture of feedback if you don't have a culture of trust, right? So the first thing I would say is before we get into the feedback, you have to create a level of trust with people that they genuinely believe that you have their best interests at heart. If you don't have that, forget feedback because no one's going to trust you. And so what are the things that you do to do that? And so in my model, it's about connection, creating human to human connection. And there's a lot of things you can do to do that. Some of it has to do with you, first of all, getting to know people, as opposed to an employee title in an org chart box. So understanding who they are as a person, what are their interests? Do they have family? Do they have friends? Do they have hobbies? What are they interested in? And getting to know that and being engaged in conversations, and also you sharing something about you. And also in this process, it's really helpful if a leader is willing to be, I'll call it professionally vulnerable, right? We're not saying share your deepest, darkest secrets, but somehow you have to share and reveal your humanity, right? So what are some things that are challenging for you or you're struggling with, whether that's, I have an ailing parent at home, or, I'm having a really hard time finding childcare for my kid, or my kid has been sick for whatever, whatever it might be, letting them know you're human because people can connect to that. That's real, as opposed to you trying to show them how you're this awesome superhuman leader who can get everything done. Like, no, people don't want to work for superhumans, right? They want to work for superhumans, being human, not superheroes. And so I would say you have to build the connection first, because then when you're sharing feedback, people know you have their best interests in mind. And one thing that I do, I teach people this structure. I call it plus EBI. It's really simple, and I'll let me explain what plus EBI is, and then I'll talk about the process around it. So plus means, this is the part, you're talking about the sandwich technique. So for me, plus is, hey, this is what I thought went really well. This is a plus. You should keep doing this. Because sometimes people are doing things and they're not even aware they're doing them, which means they're unconsciously competent. So what's a plus? What are you doing well? How is that working? EBI stands for even better if. Hey, and this would make it even better if next time you want to do it this way. You notice by framing it in the future of this would make it even better, I didn't say that was bad. And so that way I'm not triggering any shame-based guilt, criticism. I'm wrong, I'm terrible, I can't hear. Because what happens if we have that shame-based kind of conversation and feedback, we all know it shuts us down. We're not really listening. We're not really applying anything. So this idea of plus and EBI is, if we just always have a mindset to, hey, in every moment, what's a plus? What's an EBI? Now, so that's the framework of the plus EBI, the tool, how it works. In terms of the process, let's say, for example, a simple example, you're giving a presentation, right? And so you give the presentation and an opportunity for feedback. Great, awesome. Well, first of all, congratulations, you gave the presentation. So first of all, the next thing I would say is, so what feedback do you have for yourself, right? So before I even give you feedback, I ask you to give yourself some feedback. And the reason that's really useful, as a leader, when someone is sharing self-feedback about themselves back to you, it helps you to calibrate their own understanding of what they just did. So for example, if you start sharing feedback on the plus and the EBI about your presentation, that is completely like, oh, I did this, and I'm noticing these subtleties and these nuances, we can have a very different conversation than if you just say, I think it went well because I didn't fall asleep, or they didn't fall asleep. So you can start to calibrate how you're going to speak to somebody. So if somebody is giving me a very simplistic, basic feedback, and I have 14 points of things I could talk about, I'm going to go, wow, this is not a conversation to have 14 of these 14 things. What are the top 1 or 2 things I could share that would be useful in this situation? Mm-hmm. So going back to all this again, just to kind of recap, I'd say is feedback needs to be a process, not an event. You need to create safety through connection and building relationships and trust. And then having a tool like the plus EBI can be really helpful.
Yeah, I love it. Actually, that's how Dextego works behind the scenes too. So it's based on personalized scenarios according to your role and industry. And when you record your answer of like how would you deal in that scenario, your AI codes then sees your response, facial expressions, tone, pitch, and gives you basically a report on what you did great and what you could improve on. So I do agree that's the most effective way I've seen to work. I think also there is another factor of, if someone is toxic, no matter how you do it, they will get triggered. So understanding that it's not on you and you did the right thing is also key here as a leader. Yeah. There's so much you can do to be likable by everyone, right? Like if someone has a problem, they'll continue having a problem after your feedback, and that's okay. But we talked a lot about the toxic part. So let's focus on the other side of a positive and healthy work environment where there's equity and inclusion and everyone feels welcome and supported. So what are some steps that leaders can take to get there and address any biases and discrimination that may exist within the organization prior? Let's say you just became a new CEO and the company has some toxicity in there, but you're trying to take it out and just maintain the health environment. What can someone do?
That's a huge conversation topic. So if let's say I'm a new leader or a new CEO, and we see that there's kind of toxic behaviors going on, and our ideal is around creating an environment that has equity and has inclusion. The first thing that we have to do is courage, right? It goes back to courage. Is when we see less than inclusive behaviors, we have to call them out, right? So we have to start addressing the elephants in the room. And again, we can use feedback, like we said before. Hey, in that meeting, you said this. Now, I experienced the impact of that as exclusive and shutting, or when you spoke over someone, did you realize how they shut down? Were you aware of that? I need to speak up and start, and I can do it from a place of, again, from positive intent. But I think it's so important that we have to name those things, right? So often, let's say it's microaggressions. And again, microaggressions are those small little behaviors that someone takes that oftentimes against a marginalized, a group that has been historically marginalized, and we don't even recognize that we're doing it. But if you do, do recognize it, you have to become aware and you have to name it. You have to call these things out, and also recognizing in the process, it isn't about perfection, right? Again, going back to that, it isn't, oh, that person said that, we have to fire them now. Let's bring them up on charges. It's, I mean, look, if there's certain major grievances, maybe you do. But other than that, I would, and this is where and this is in my experience, having worked with organizations around work, like around inclusion and unconscious bias, we're all going to make mistakes. Let me rephrase that. I'm going to make mistakes. I have made mistakes. And when I do make mistakes, what can I do? Let's go back to my ego. Let me get humble. Let me apologize. Whoa, I didn't do that. How could I have said that differently? Can you help me to understand that? I would like to get better. And it is hard. It is hard to put yourself in a situation where you're like, I don't know, because especially in corporate world, we have this belief around, I have to seem like I'm this polished, smart professional who seems to be so competent all the time. If you could let go of that hang up, if you can just experience like, I don't know, what can I do better? How can I learn from you? Please teach me in this moment. And then, when it comes to equity, this is another, I mean, we talk about equity, and equity can look like a lot of things. An obvious one is the pay gap, right? So let's say gender pay gap equity is, are you willing to recognize this is not fair? And I need to change our policies, our structures, so that it becomes fair, right? And so what that probably means, and for some people, that means I may have to pay myself a little less to pay someone else a little more. Are you willing to do that, right? Because that's, because I don't know, again, this is one of the things where I have just seen working in lots of different organizations, and we don't like to talk about it because, we're not supposed to talk about this stuff. But greed, right? You see people who are greedy, who are selfish, who are self-focused, and they don't recognize that part of how they are able to achieve so much is on the backs of other people. I mean, do we really, I mean, I know I'm kind of maybe wading into some political waters here, but look at CEO pay versus frontline worker pay, and how much the ratio, and I don't even know where it is now, but it's gone up and up and up and up, and it's something like, whatever it is, 900 times more, at what expense? At what expense? And then the question to me is like, and how much is enough? Is there ever enough? Because you're working in an organization. Now, again, I am not suggesting that we go, full on communist and everyone gets exactly the same of everything. But what I am suggesting here is to be aware of, when we're talking about things like equity, how do we make sure that we value the worth of everyone in a way that they feel valued, right? And that's challenging. That is challenging to do. And some of our business models may be a bit broken to be able to do that. Maybe some of our business models are dependent on certain people, for example, earning a wage that is not sustainable, can't do it. So what are you going to do there? So anyway, I know I'm kind of wandered into some potentially political hotbed stuff around that, but no, it's so, I think this goes back to what we talked about earlier, the sense that, leadership development is personal development, and it starts by looking in the mirror. And are you willing to look in the mirror? And, and how do you really feel? It's only possible to pay someone a wage that is not sustainable if you have otherized them, right? If you have made them feel like, well, that's just what the business needs. And there are these, you're no longer talking about people here. You're looking at people as human resources, right? Like literal human resources, a cog in the machine, and that they are little cogs in the machine. And so really take a look at your practices. around what you're doing for equity and inclusion? And are you willing to have courage to change them?
Right. And what I think is also very true is that the same can take place for high potential employees. Like you can stretch someone so much, even if you pay them well, that at the end of the day, not only is it sustainable, like they're gonna burn out and then they're never gonna want to work for you anymore.
Yeah.
Or you can destroy someone's career, literally. Like I think a CEO or a manager has so much responsibility in terms of the rest of this person's life, not just
Yeah.
the amount of time they work with them, that
Yeah.
it's very crucial for people to understand that. I think the same goes for, professors to students. Anyone that passes through your hands in terms of talent and like motivation, loyalty to you, which is so
Yeah.
important. And sometimes people don't even take a moment to think about it. Like, okay, I mean, we're paying them, so they better do that. And it's just a very wrong approach, in my opinion.
Yeah, as you're touching on that, it's reminding me of, I just wrote an article for Forbes around purpose. And there's some great research from McKinsey that's saying that, not only like 83% of US employees think that purpose is important, that organizations have a purpose, but beyond that too, is that 70% of them say that they derive their sense of purpose from work. So it kind of ties to what you were just saying, is that, for the vast majority of people, they get their sense of what I do matters out of work. And so if you are in a leadership role in a work setting, that is an awesomely large responsibility. It's also an awesomely large opportunity to make a difference in the lives of the people around you. And I think if we don't remember that, we are missing out on something that is just huge.
Very true. Wow. And back to looking to yourself in the mirror, I think that's a lot about self-respect,
Yeah.
right? Like you need to be able to value yourself first for someone else to value you. But a lot of people have self-limiting beliefs.
Mhm.
So can you talk about how someone can overcome them to create a growth mindset? And how can individuals basically identify and challenge those limiting beliefs? How can they catch them early on so they don't grow too big?
Yeah, it's interesting. As we're talking, these are huge, wonderful questions, right? Like, what do you do around your own limiting beliefs and how they get in the way of your growth mindset? This is a really hard thing to do on your own. So I would say whether it's with a colleague, a trusted friend, whether it's with a therapist, whether it's with a coach, someone where you can start to articulate and start to name what are the beliefs that you have. And also recognizing that, and I'm a big fan of, there's something called internal family systems, which is a kind of a therapeutic way of looking at the world. And I say that because I think that so internal family systems holds the supposition that human beings aren't a singular unified thing, that in fact, we have multiple parts. So I share that because it may be that a part of you has this belief, and there's another part that has a different belief, but in certain situations, the part that has this limiting belief gets activated. And so I think just doing the work, and I sometimes akin to like peeling layers of an onion, it's constant, never ending. It's like the willingness to take a look at, okay, so what is this belief that I have? Where did it come from? And here's the thing, it's not like, oh, I got this limiting belief, I need to get rid of it. Just notice your own reaction. I even, in terms of limiting belief, do you have an emotional trigger to that already? Or can you go, okay, this belief, this belief that, there's scarcity. Where does that come from? Wow, it comes from the fact that, like, I was raised by some people who had a really strong belief that there wasn't enough to go around. And so that my kind of adopting that belief was a way of feeling loved, because that was the worldview system that I was growing up in. By the way, I am speaking autobiographically, so this is one of the ones that's like, "Hi, it seems like he knows what he's talking about." Yeah, and so recognizing that, what, when I was 2 and 5 and 10 years old, that belief served me really well, because it was a way for me to feel connected to the people that I was around. Okay, that's great. But you know what? As a 40-year-old, having that belief, there may be some things that are getting in the way professionally if I'm having that scarcity mindset around trying on new opportunities or taking a risk. And this, so I think unpeeling these layers And part of this is I encourage all of us to be a detective, right? And so detectives, while they're getting clues, there's a certain sense of detachment and distance that you have from your own story. And what's so easy is for so many of us is that we get sucked into the drama of, oh, I didn't do this well. Oh, this doesn't work. Oh, and this is where, like, again, having a sounding board, a colleague, a coach, someone who can listen and reflect back of, well, how did that work for you? How does that not work for you? To start to move through and consider these things in a different way. So I'd say, and when you start to do that, these beliefs don't feel so fixed. Again, if we think about the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset is supple and malleable and flexible and like, oh, what did I learn from this? It's not that I'm a failure. It's just I haven't tried this yet. Or this comes from, if I did this effort, then I could achieve this. So the more that I can embrace taking a look at my beliefs with a sense of curiosity and compassion and concern and care, the more likely in the discovery of what I'm learning, I'm going to naturally start to adopt more of a growth mindset, right? In the sense of I can learn, I can grow, I can change, right? The human brain is amazingly plastic and we can learn things all through our entire lives. And so the invitation to all of us listening is, what can we do to be curious? And I'll say in general, be a bit gentler with yourself and with others. Because when you do that, you calm your own neurological system down, that you can do, you're that way, because otherwise you're going to start activating all your kind of sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight and freeze responses, and you're going to be stuck. And we know that when you're in that kind of place, learning does not happen. So the more that you can be gentle and curious and compassionate and caring and concerning with yourself. And then, you know what? Why not take all those same approaches and use them with other people too, right? That's just, again, we can flip that. As a leader, you want to support other people, bring that same attitude of care, curiosity, concern, compassion in that, because then you can partner with them to help them to grow and take on new ideas and maybe shed some of the old layers of limiting beliefs.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about neuroplasticity, and I see myself now doing and learning things that I never thought I would. And it's just a beautiful journey when you recognize that and you can see how much you can grow. It's beautiful. I mean, and every little thing you learn just opens the whole, world, a new horizon of what you can do in life. So it's a beautiful journey for sure. So Alain, one more question for you.
Sure.
We're close this webinar. I mean, I've learned so much. It's just amazing. In just 1 hour, you said so many interesting things. But in your opinion, where is leadership going? What's your vision for the future of leadership? How you think even AI or technology is impacting that? And in your eyes, what is an ideal leader for the 21st century?
Oh, I love this question. Yeah. So the words that come to mind about the future of leadership, the 2 words, it's going to be fundamentally human, right? So we think AI is going to get very good at doing a lot of things that people used to do. I mean, I've been playing with Chat GPT. I'm like, oh, that's a pretty good first draft of that essay that I just gave them a prompt. Just, scary in and of itself. But at the end of the day, as leaders, nothing is going to replace humans. And the specific things around, and it's funny because Dan Pink wrote this book a number of years ago called A Whole New Mind, How Right-Brainers Will Rule the World. And he had this premise that, anything that's going to be automated or outsourced or offshored or, basically given to an algorithm or technology is going to be, and this book was written 25 years ago. We're moving more and more in that direction. However, what are the fundamental human things that cannot be changed, right? And some of that has to do with things like empathy, right? Mm-hmm. The importance that as human beings, we are wired to connect, right? We are mammals. We need to be living in community. We want to feel included. So I think the future of leadership is going to be humanistic, inclusive, empathetic. I think the future is going to be collaborative, connected. We're going to find how we work well together. And also the other piece that, AI has certainly having a hard time now with, and is going to potentially do, is, yeah, it can spit all this out, but only after you give it the prompts. Whereas I think one of the things that humans are going to need to be able to do, and leaders are going to have to do, is synthesize and integrate. It's like, how does this piece fit to this piece? And how do we take this thing that seems like it's completely from left field, and how do we integrate it with this piece over here and make something totally new? And also for leaders to create environments that facilitate innovation and coming up with these new ideas. So ultimately, the future of leadership is very much fundamentally human, which is why I think everything we've talked about today, looking in the mirror, having those courageous, difficult conversations, looking at feedback, being more compassionate and concerning, shedding limiting beliefs and growth mindset, those are all under the umbrella of, these are the fundamental human skills that we all need to adopt to thrive in the 21st century and beyond.
Couldn't agree more. Do you have any favorite leadership quote?
Yeah, I have a couple of them. Let me think. So one of my favorite quotes comes from Albert Schweitzer, and he said, Albert Schweitzer, look him up. He won the Nobel Prize in 2 different categories, which is impressive. He said, "Example is not the main thing in influencing others. It is the only thing." So that's one of my favorite quotes around leadership. And another one, which happens to be a quote that I've shared a couple times, like, oh, that's really good. Be vulnerable. You never know who you'll be inspiring. So
I like it. Yeah, that's true. You never know who's watching, so be
yeah,
your best self.
yeah, exactly. And the thing is, I like this idea of being vulnerable, because I think that is, again, it takes a huge amount of courage and strength to be vulnerable, which again sounds like a paradox, but leadership is filled with paradoxes. And so sometimes that's what makes us the most effective, is when we're doing the least and being the most. So
And it starts with self-awareness, as we said. So thank you so much for your time. This was a wonderful conversation. And tell us where people can find you to get more of your thought leadership and experience.
sure thing, Ioanna. Thanks. So best thing to do is just go to my website, which is Alain Hunkins, ALAINHUNKINS.com. I share lots of stuff there. I also am very active on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or follow my work there. And again, if you follow Forbes.com, I put out a new article every month there. That's usually pretty well received. And yeah, so thanks for tuning in, folks. And Ioanna, thank you again. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you and take care, everyone. Bye.